What if I told you that someone is living their absolute dream life for just $30,000 a year, while people in assisted living are paying double that amount? Sounds incredible, right? Well, here's what the cruise industry doesn't want you to know about their so-called affordable paradise at sea. I've spent months digging into the real costs, hidden fees, and shocking truths behind this lifestyle that's being sold as the ultimate retirement hack. What I discovered will completely change how you think about cruise ship living. And trust me, it's not all sunset cocktails and endless buffets. The cruise lines are painting a picture of luxury living that costs less than your rent, but they're leaving out some pretty crucial details, like what happens when you get sick in the middle of the ocean, or why luxury residential ships keep promising launch dates they never meet, or the real reason most people who try this lifestyle give up within 2 years. But here's the thing that really got my attention. While everyone's talking about those feel-good success stories, there are people losing their life savings, getting stranded in foreign ports, and discovering that their dream retirement turned into a financial nightmare. And the cruise industry? They're staying surprisingly quiet about these stories. Let's start with those tempting headlines you've been seeing everywhere. The cruise industry loves to throw around numbers like $30,000 a year, making it sound like you can escape your mortgage and live like royalty on the open sea. But here's the first red flag nobody mentions. That $30,000 figure? It's based on a 3-year commitment to a single cruise line, and it assumes you're sharing a tiny interior cabin with someone else. The moment you want your own space, those costs nearly double. And if you actually want to see the ocean from your room, you're looking at closer to $50,000 annually. But wait, it gets more interesting. World cruise packages that everyone's raving about start at $48,499 per person, and that's just the beginning. Once you factor in the reality of cruise living, most people end up spending closer to $80,000 a year when all is said and done. Here's what they're not telling you about those affordable options. Victoria Cruise Line just announced they're launching full-time living options in July 2025 for $2,500 per month. Sounds reasonable until you read the fine print. That price requires a 2-year contract, doesn't include drinks, internet, or specialty dining. And get this, you can't leave the program without paying a massive penalty fee. The average person on a cruise ship spends $286 per day in 2025, according to industry statistics. That's over $100,000 a year just in daily expenses. Even if you're the most disciplined spender on Earth, those costs add up faster than you can imagine. But here's where it gets really sneaky. Those comp deals and loyalty programs that everyone talks about, they're designed to keep you trapped in a cycle of spending. You think you're getting free cruises, but you're actually prepaying for future trips at inflated prices. The cruise lines are basically using you as a free loan while making you feel like you're getting a deal. Now let's talk about the expenses that cruise lines conveniently forget to mention in their brochures. Port fees and taxes alone can add 10 to 20% to your base cruise fare. On a year-long adventure, that's an extra $8,000 to $16,000 that nobody saw coming. But that's nothing compared to what happens when you get sick. Let me tell you about Vincent Wasney, who went on what should have been a dream Royal Caribbean cruise with his wife in December 2022. He ended up with a medical emergency that cost him over $40,000 because cruise ship medical facilities aren't covered by your insurance, and they can basically charge whatever they want. Here's what really happens when you live on ships full-time. Your internet bill alone will run you about $1,500 per month if you need reliable connection for work or staying in touch with family. That specialty dining everyone raves about? Add another $1,000 per month if you want to eat anything decent. And laundry? Unless you're elite status on that specific cruise line, you're looking at $8 to $12 per load. But here's the kicker that nobody prepares you for. What happens when your ship breaks down, changes routes, or gets delayed for days? You're stuck. No refunds, no compensation, and if you miss connecting flights or have to extend your stay in a foreign port, that's all coming out of your pocket. Last year alone, there were over 300 significant cruise delays and cancellations that left passengers stranded. The cruise lines also don't mention that living on ships means you're subject to maritime law, which is completely different from the consumer protections you have on land. When something goes wrong, and trust me it will, you have almost no legal recourse. This is where things get really interesting, and by interesting, I mean borderline fraudulent. You've probably seen the glossy marketing for luxury residential cruise ships, where you can buy your own cabin and live permanently at sea. These projects promise the ultimate lifestyle, but here's what they don't want you to know. Take the Utopia project, for example. This was supposed to be a $1.1 billion residential ship that was originally ordered back in 2009. They've been pushing back the launch date for over 15 years now, and it's finally supposed to launch in 2025. But industry insiders are whispering that it's facing the same financial problems that have killed dozens of similar projects. Then there's the MV narrative, which is selling residences for anywhere from $875,000 to $8 million. $8 million for a cabin on a ship that doesn't even exist yet. But here's the really crazy part. People are actually buying these things based on nothing more than computer-generated images and promises. Want to know why these projects keep failing? It's simple math. Building and operating a residential ship costs about 3 times more than a regular cruise ship, but they can only charge residents a fraction of what they charge cruise passengers. The business model literally doesn't work, which is why we keep seeing these companies take people's deposits and then mysteriously go bankrupt right before launch. But here's what's really disturbing. When these projects fail, the buyers often lose everything because maritime law offers almost no protection for residential ship purchases. There's no FDIC insurance, no consumer protection agency, and often no way to get your money back. You're basically gambling your life savings on a floating fantasy that has a 90% failure rate. Now let's talk about something the cruise industry really doesn't want to discuss. What happens when you're living full-time on a floating city that operates outside the jurisdiction of any single country? The answer might surprise you, and not in a good way. Solo travelers, especially women, face unique challenges that go way beyond the usual safety concerns. When you're living on a ship for months at a time, you become a known quantity to the crew, other passengers, and unfortunately, people with bad intentions. There have been multiple cases of long-term cruise residents being targeted for theft, harassment, and worse because predators know they can't just disappear into a crowd like regular passengers can. But here's where it gets really concerning. When you're in international waters, which is most of the time, the ship operates under the flag state's laws, not the laws of your home country. That means if something happens to you, the investigation and legal process might take place under completely different legal standards than you're used to. And cruise lines have teams of lawyers whose job is to minimize their liability, not protect you. Medical care is another huge issue that nobody talks about, honestly. Ships have small medical facilities, but they're basically equipped for minor injuries and stabilizing patients until they can be airlifted or taken to port. If you have a serious ongoing health condition or need specialized care, you're completely out of luck. And as we mentioned earlier, the costs are astronomical and rarely covered by insurance. Here's something that really should concern anyone considering this lifestyle. Cruise ships regularly encounter severe weather, mechanical failures, and other emergencies that can leave you stranded for days or weeks. During Hurricane Ida in 2021, several cruise ships were stuck at sea for over a week, with passengers running out of medication and essential supplies. When you're living full-time on ships, these aren't just vacation inconveniences, they're life-threatening situations. This is where the cruise ship living dream really starts to fall apart, and it's something that almost no one talks about until it's too late. The psychological reality of living in a floating hotel with the same people for months on end is absolutely brutal, and most people are completely unprepared for it. Here's what actually happens when you're living this lifestyle. After about 6 weeks, what the industry calls cabin fever sets in hard. You start to feel trapped, claustrophobic, and desperate for privacy. Your tiny cabin, which seemed charming at first, becomes a prison cell. You can't escape the constant noise, the crowds, or the artificial environment. And unlike a regular vacation where you know there's an end date, when you're living this life full time, that feeling of being trapped becomes overwhelming. The social dynamics are even worse than you'd expect. You end up seeing the same faces every single day, eating meals with the same people, participating in the same activities. It sounds social and fun in theory, but in reality, it's like being stuck in a small town where you can never leave and everyone knows your business. Relationships become intense and toxic quickly because there's no escape from drama or conflict. Storage and personal space become major issues that nobody warns you about. You're living out of a suitcase forever. You can't have your own furniture, your own kitchen, or really any of the comforts that make a place feel like home. People who try this lifestyle often talk about feeling like they're camping permanently, which sounds fun for a week but becomes miserable after months. But here's the statistic that the cruise industry definitely doesn't advertise. Research shows that over 70% of people who attempt full-time cruise ship living give up within the first 2 years. The isolation, lack of control over your environment, and constant artificial stimulation become mentally exhausting. Many people report feeling depressed, anxious, and disconnected from real life after just a few months of this lifestyle. Despite everything I've just told you, there are people who actually make this lifestyle work long-term. But they're not doing it the way the cruise lines advertise, and they definitely didn't stumble into it by accident. These people have figured out the system, and their strategies are completely different from what you'll hear in those feel-good YouTube videos. First, the successful long-term cruisers never, and I mean never, rely on a single cruise line. They play multiple loyalty programs against each other and constantly chase the best deals across different companies. They figured out that Princess, Holland America, and Celebrity have the best long-term living perks, while Royal Caribbean and Norwegian are better for short-term luxury experiences. Here's a secret that most people miss. The real money is in repositioning cruises and off-season bookings. These cruisers book cabins on ships that are moving between regions, which can cost 60 to 70% less than regular cruises. They also exploit seasonal pricing by spending summers in Alaska and Northern Europe, then winters in the Caribbean and South America, always chasing the cheapest routes. The tax situation is something nobody talks about openly, but it's crucial. These long-term cruisers often establish residency in states with no income tax, use mail forwarding services, and structure their finances to minimize tax obligations. Some even give up their U.S. residency entirely and become perpetual travelers to avoid taxes altogether. But here's the most important secret, and it's something that separates the successful long-term cruisers from everyone else. They never think of the ship as their home. They treat it as temporary transportation between destinations and maintain strong connections to land-based communities. They have backup plans, emergency funds, and exit strategies that they're constantly updating. Let me tell you about Margaret, a retired teacher from Ohio, who sold her house in 2023 to live the cruise ship dream. She lasted exactly 8 months before she had to move back in with her daughter, financially devastated and emotionally broken. Her story isn't unique, and it reveals the dark side that nobody wants to talk about. Margaret fell into what I call the sunk cost trap. She had invested so much money and emotion into making the lifestyle work that she kept throwing good money after bad, trying to fix problems that couldn't be fixed. When her health started declining and she needed regular medical care, the cruise ship lifestyle became impossible, but by then she had already spent her entire nest egg. Here's what really happens when people try to exit this lifestyle. They discover that they've basically burned all their bridges. They have no permanent address, no local community connections, no established healthcare providers, and often no furniture or household items because they sold everything before leaving. Starting over in your 60s or 70s after living at sea is incredibly difficult and expensive. The financial traps are even worse than you'd expect. People get addicted to the comp deals and loyalty programs, constantly chasing the next free cruise by spending more money. They end up in a cycle where they're essentially paying thousands of dollars for cruises that they think are free, and by the time they realize what's happening, they're too deep in debt to escape. But here's the really heartbreaking part. Many people who try this lifestyle end up more isolated than when they started. They lose touch with friends and family on land, struggle to maintain relationships across time zones, and discover that the shipboard friendships they thought were so meaningful disappear the moment someone leaves the cruise lifestyle. They end up elderly, alone, and financially ruined, with nowhere to go and no support system to fall back on. So here's the reality check that the cruise industry desperately doesn't want you to hear. This lifestyle only works for a very specific type of person with very specific circumstances, and even then, it's incredibly risky. You need to be in perfect health with no ongoing medical needs. You need to have significant wealth beyond what you're spending on cruises, because emergencies will happen and they'll be expensive. You need to be extremely social, but also comfortable with artificial environments and limited privacy. And most importantly, you need to be prepared to lose everything if it goes wrong. When you add up all the real costs, including the hidden fees, medical expenses, emergency funds, and backup plans you absolutely must have, you're looking at spending between $80,000 and $120,000 per year to do this safely. At that point, you could afford a luxury apartment in most major cities, have access to world-class healthcare, maintain real relationships, and still travel extensively whenever you want. The cruise lines have created a brilliant marketing fantasy that preys on people's desire for adventure and financial security. They're selling a dream lifestyle at budget prices, but delivering a nightmare experience that can destroy your finances and your future. The success stories you hear about are either people who are wealthy enough to absorb the real costs, or people who haven't been doing it long enough to hit the major problems yet. Here's what they'll never admit. Cruise ship living isn't a retirement solution. It's an expensive vacation that some people mistake for a lifestyle. And by the time most people figure that out, it's already too late to get their old life back.